continuing our video series here on the case for the resurrection. Mike, it's good to have you again. I'm Michael Patton, Mike Licona. Welcome those of you who are trying to dig deep into your faith and establish the historicity of the resurrection. We hope we're able to do that a little bit more here today. Mike, we're continuing to talk about trying to gain people's confidence by looking at the resurrection from a historical standpoint, from the eye of a historian, because we believe that if Jesus Christ became incarnate, which means in the flesh, if he took on flesh in actual history, if they named dates and times and places, in the accounts, that all of a sudden God has opened himself up to historic investigation. And so that's why we do this, right?
Absolutely.
One of the Israelites were in the Old Testament looking to the other gods after God had delivered them out of Israel, after God had told them and done all kinds of things. Then all of a sudden they're beginning to follow other gods. And in Isaiah 40 through 48, God comes in and says, hey, listen, pause, stop. What are you guys doing? You're being completely irrational. You're following gods that you have to carry. You're following gods that you have to, after you cut down the tree, you use half of it for the fire and keep yourself warm, and the other half, you bow down to it and say, you're my God, save me. And what God basically says, and he says at one point in Isaiah 11, he says, nobody stops to think. Nobody stops to think. I used half the wood to burn and make myself warm, and the other half I'm saying, you're my God, save me. And what we're doing here is pausing, and we're saying, let's stop and think. Let's look at what God has done. Let's renew that call of Isaiah 40 through 48 and say, if he was to come to us today, if he was to come to so many Christians today and say, well, what's the problem with us? He says, nobody stops to think that I actually moved in history. Nobody stops to think that the resurrection actually happened. So I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you being able to take us through the historicity of the resurrection. We've talked a little bit about sources. We said we need lots of sources. You named some things like we need multiple attestation as a historian to verify historical events, or we want. What are the ideals again?
Well, we want early sources, preferably those written by eyewitnesses. We want multiple independent sources.
Early, multiple.
We want unsympathetic sources. So if you have someone like Tacitus, who is actually not only unsympathetic, but he's hostile because he refers to Christianity as an evil and mischievous superstition. So when he talks about the death of Jesus, then you can't say it's just biased Christians mentioning it. You have someone here who's not only unsympathetic, but hostile.
Okay.
Josephus may be considered unsympathetic. He's not hostile, but he's not pro-Christian.
Okay.
So we want that and some sources that may reveal some embarrassing insights.
That's interesting. I want to talk about the embarrassing insights in just a moment. We've laid out our case of what we have available for us, and we talked about 27 New Testament documents. We talked about early church fathers. We talked about Greek and or Roman historians and Jewish historians. We talked about even these weird things maybe you'll get into more later if we need to, but called the Gnostic Gospels that were written within a couple of hundred years of the resurrection. From this, let's try to draw out some of the key things. What are the key things that we can establish from the sources that we have?
Well, for example, Jesus' death by crucifixion. It's reported in early sources. For example, not only do the Gospels mention it, and they're written 20 to 65 years later, but Paul's letters, and you have some oral tradition that's embedded in Paul's letters that, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, that we can trace back very, very early because we can show that Paul received this information within 20 years of Jesus' crucifixion, and he received it from probably the Jerusalem apostles. So we're looking at the eyewitnesses themselves who passes along this information to Paul. And certainly, even if he didn't receive it from them, which he probably did, but even if he didn't, he knew them so he could vouchsafe that this was accurate information. This is one of the most astounding findings, recent findings in New Testament research. this oral tradition that's embedded throughout the New Testament, especially Paul's letters, because it goes back so early and we can trace it to the Jerusalem apostles. So it's early, eyewitness, attesting to Jesus' execution. We have independent sources, unsympathetic sources like Tacitus, who refers to Christianity as an evil and mischievous superstition.
Yeah.
So he's not only unsympathetic, he's hostile.
Yeah.
And he mentions Jesus' execution
Yeah.
at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So you got multiple independent sources, eyewitness sources, unsympathetic sources, early sources. I mean, really good stuff.
Okay, so whenever we're talking about the actual crucifixion of Jesus, what you're saying here is that historians can establish this with a great degree of historic certainty.
That's correct.
Is this agreed upon? I mean, are there people out there that say, yeah, I don't think Jesus ever was crucified or even ever existed?
Yeah, I mean, you got a fruits and flakes out there, but I mean, you've got Holocaust deniers.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to have.
Would you compare that type of denier to
I
a
would
Holocaust
say
denier?
someone who denies the existence of Jesus is no different than a Holocaust denier or those who would say we've never been to the moon.
And there's people out there who say we haven't
There
been to the
are.
moon.
They're loony. And, you
Yeah.
know,
They're loony nice.
you know, the evidence for Jesus' existence is astonishing. I mean, and the evidence for his death by crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. You have people like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, Gerrit Ludemann, an atheist New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman, an agnostic New Testament scholar, and all these guys, you know, renowned skeptics, and they'll say that Jesus' death by crucifixion is indisputable, is one of the most established facts of the ancient world. It's a certain fact of history, that kind of stuff. So, yeah, you got Jesus' death by crucifixion, you got the appearances to the disciples, and what I mean by that is that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences in both individual and in group settings that they were convinced were of the risen Jesus who appeared to them. And these experiences transformed them. So it's not to say that they actually, that Jesus appeared to them, risen from the dead, but it is to say that they had experiences that they were convinced were of the risen Jesus who appeared to them.
Okay.
And as a
okay.
historian, we have to account for what was it they saw.
Pause for a moment. Then we've got the death by crucifixion as one of the bedrock.
Yep. Everybody agrees
Next
on that.
one is that
Appearances to the disciples.
the disciples at least claimed. Is that what we're doing as historians?
Claimed and believed.
Okay,
Claimed
claimed
and
and believed.
sincerely believed, which is evidenced through their willingness to suffer continuously and die for their faith.
Claimed and believed. Okay, then as a bedrock to a historian and saying these are the things that we can establish, the apostles claimed. Are we talking about all the apostles that we can, as historians, establish? Or are we talking just Paul or just James or just Peter?
No, I think everybody would. I think even skeptical scholars would agree. It's pretty much all of them. Can we establish all of them? No, but I think we can say the 12.
Okay.
You know, of course, Judas is gone, but you have Matthias that comes in and replaces him. And certainly the pillars of the church, Peter, James, John,
Yeah.
and then later Paul.
Yeah.
So you've got these leaders who would say that these disciples had experiences they perceived were of the risen Jesus.
Okay.
They sincerely believed it was of the risen Jesus. Everybody seems to agree on that.
Okay, can you help me though, and help everybody listening? Why is it that everybody agrees with that one? What is the source documentation? Again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, all these different sources. Why is it that people will say, I understand death by crucifixion, you went into Tacitus, you went into all the different multiple attestation, early attestation. Why is it that everybody believes that the apostles believed that they saw Jesus alive?
Well, first of all, we know that they're claiming it.
Okay.
You've got it in Paul. And in that oral tradition, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 3 through 7, Paul says, I'm delivering to you what I also received. And in verse 1 he says, I'm going to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you, and which you were saved. Well, in Galatians chapter 2, both of these, by the way, are undisputedly written by Paul. In Galatians 2, Paul says that he went up to Jerusalem and ran the gospel that he had been preaching past the Jerusalem apostles, the pillars of the church, Peter, James, and John. Imagine these, being in a room with Peter, James, John, and Paul, the Fab Four, and you're able to discuss theology and history with these guys. What did Jesus say? What did he do? This is what's going on. And Paul's saying, hey, this is the message I've been preaching. Guys, am I right? You know, if I'm right, if I'm wrong, would you correct me and get me straight on this? If I'm right, endorse what I'm having to say. And he says, they had added nothing to what I had to say. They gave me the right hand of fellowship. In other words, you're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. So Paul says he's preaching the same thing that they're preaching. And then in 1 Corinthians 15 says, the gospel that I preached to you, I'm going to remind you of it. And then he gives them this oral tradition. Christ died for our sins. He's buried, raised, and appeared, and then 6 post-resurrection appearances. So it's early, it's eyewitness, because he's got the Jerusalem apostles behind it. You had Clement of Rome and Polycarp. We mentioned them earlier. These are 2 guys that were probably discipled by the apostles Peter and John, respectively. And if Paul was preaching differently than the Jerusalem apostles, we would expect Clement and Polycarp to chide and correct Paul on it. Instead, we find Clement saying that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. Polycarp refers to the blessed Paul, quotes from his writings at least twice, and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. These aren't the kind of things you say about someone if he's preaching heresy. They're exactly what you say if the guy was preaching what your mentors Peter and John were preaching. Now that shows that they were claiming that Jesus rose and had appeared to them. In terms of showing that they believed it, we have no less than 11 ancient sources that report that these same disciples and Paul were willing to suffer continuously, that they did suffer continuously. They were willing to die, and we can establish historically that at least some of them actually were martyred for their Christian faith. So, and this shows that they were sincere about their beliefs. They weren't just claiming it, they believed it. After all, liars make poor martyrs.
Yeah.
So we can show that the disciples were not only claiming that Jesus had been raised from the dead, we can actually demonstrate it that they really believed it.
So in the end of this second bedrock, what we're saying is that it would take a great leap of faith as a historian for you to say, you know what, I don't really believe that they believe they saw Jesus, or I don't even think it's ever claimed that they saw Jesus. Historically, it is claimed. Historically, it can be established to the point of a great degree of certainty that the apostles say they saw Jesus and believe that he rose from the grave.
Right. Most historians would say, that's what we've got. Now you've got to be able to account for what led to those beliefs. You might say they were deluded or experienced a hallucination or something else. But the majority of historians today would say they saw something. What it was, the skeptical ones will say, we don't know what it was or what caused it, but they did see something.
Okay, continuing about bedrock foundational events. Number 1, death by crucifixion. Got it. Number 2, apostles believed that they saw Jesus Christ dead and then raised afterwards, or saw his crucifixion and then him raised. They had a changed life. Bedrock, historical foundation for you in establishing the resurrection.
Right.
What else?
Well, just about everybody also agrees that a skeptic named Paul, while he was out persecuting the church, arresting Christians, beating them, imprisoning them, consenting to their executions for being Christians, all of a sudden he had an experience that convinced him was Jesus, the risen Jesus who had appeared to him. And this experience radically transformed his life from a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Everybody agrees on that. The reason being is because you've got Paul himself on a number of occasions, in a number of his letters, says that this is what's the case. You have Luke in Acts, the book of Acts, corroborates it with the story about his conversion experience and what happened before then, him persecuting the church. You also have what appears to be an oral tradition preserved in Galatians chapter 1, I believe it's verse 23, where Paul says they didn't recognize him, but they had heard that he who persecuted the church now proclaims the faith he once sought to destroy. That appears to be oral tradition. So you have eyewitness, early, and multiple independent sources. So again, this is very good stuff in terms of historical evidence. And then we have multiple sources that talk about how, including Paul himself, how he did suffer for his gospel proclamation. And then a number of sources report his martyrdom.
Okay, and okay? Three deals. We got death by crucifixion. Apostles believed it. Paul, a former skeptic, now converted to Christianity.
Yep, and that's why Paul is separate from the others. He's different. These, the apostles, were Jesus' friends.
So do you
Paul-
consider him a hostile source?
Oh, absolutely. At least, at the time of his conversion,
Okay.
he's a hostile source.
I mean, because to have a hostile source that remains hostile if they are to proclaim the resurrection would be really odd. Wouldn't it? Somebody come
Well,
up.
yeah, someone says, well, you don't have a hostile source at the time they're writing, excuse me, who's proclaiming the resurrection. In other words, so say, look at what you're looking for. You're looking for someone who reports Jesus' resurrection. They believe Jesus rose from the dead, but they're not a Christian. Say, yeah, okay, well, if you had that, I mean, the person would have to be a moron.
Yeah.
And so you would discredit them as a witness anyway.
Yeah.
So you can't have that. It's just...
I find this kind of interesting because you do find this quite a bit, folks, whenever you're talking about evidences for the resurrection. I do find people often saying that they want evidences that are all hostile, basically, that they cannot come from within this circle called Christian. And the problem with that is so tremendous. I mean, it's kind of like saying, I will not believe in the assassination of JFK until you find someone who doesn't actually believe it, but actually saw the assassination happen,
Yeah.
And so the credibility of our witnesses that we're dealing with here, folks, to back up a few sessions and say this once again, remember, we're just dealing with different sources, different ancient documents. We call it the Bible, we call it the New Testament, we call it 27 books of the New Testament canon, but back then, all they were for the first 200 years was just a bunch of sources that you had to look back and see if they were any good, see if they were reliable. And so we've got these different sources that we're looking at that we believe are reliable, that give the multiple attestation and even the unsympathetic or hostile with Paul. Beyond that, looking out to the early church fathers, just briefly for a moment.
Well, you go ahead.
Well, I'm just, you feel free to jump in here and fill in this, what I'm talking about, but what we would expect in this tidal wave to happen is that the early church fathers would be caught up in this tidal wave. Paul and the apostles would, boom, here's a boulder dropped in the historical lake that God dropped, so that's what we're claiming, and then you wouldn't expect it just to have this effect and then die out real quick. But one of the most important parts of all this is that it continues on. I mean, here at the Credo House, we've just got tons of books, but one of them is a huge section of all the early church fathers. And all the early church fathers starting in the 1st century and the early 2nd century, Papias and Clement and Ignatius and all of these that continue in the same exact tradition.
Yeah, and some of them are more important than others, earlier ones, but especially Clement of Rome and Polycarp, because other sources show that they were probably discipled by the apostles Peter and John. Papias is also important because there's some ties there where he might be affiliated with the Apostle John. So these are our most important ones: Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and Papias.
Okay, good.